We don't need your opinion, Mom. The words cut through me like a cold wind, sharp and final as if they'd been rehearsed. I stood there, plate in hand, in the middle of my daughter's living room, a room I helped her decorate in a house I co-signed for on a holiday. I had cooked for Marissa, didn't even look up after saying it. Her friends chuckled quietly, eyes glued to their wine glasses. Eli, my grandson, blinked once, confused, then looked away. I didn't say a word. I smiled. It was the kind of smile you wear when your insides collapse, but your dignity demands a performance. I walked into the kitchen under the weight of invisible stares, placed the plate down with care, and quietly stepped outside to breathe. That was the moment, the exact second something inside me shifted, not in anger, but in clarity, the kind of clarity that doesn't shout or cry. It simply decides. 5 minutes later, sitting in my car, I pulled up my lawyer's number from my contacts. It was still saved under Tom Will Trust. I tapped the screen. Tom, it's Lena. I'd like to make a change to my will. Before all of this, before the cold words and quiet exits, my life was centered around Marissa, my only daughter, my pride, my heartbeat. I was 27 when my husband Jack passed suddenly from a stroke. Marissa was just 7. I remember standing at his funeral, holding her small hand in mine, promising myself that no matter how hard things got, I would give her everything, and I did. I picked up extra shifts at the high school, tutored after hours, and skipped vacations for a decade to save for her future. Every decision I made, from the car I drove to the meals I skipped, was rooted in making her life better than mine. We were close, at least I believe we were. When she got accepted into Georgetown, we both cried. I sold the antique necklace my grandmother left me to help cover the dorm costs. She never asked me to, but she also never stopped me. I considered it a gift to the woman she was becoming. After college, she landed a job at a consulting firm and eventually married Mark, a kind man with a patient smile. They had Eli 3 years later. I was there in the delivery room whispering encouragement as Marissa gripped my hand. When he was placed in her arms, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I get it now, Mom. I really do." That moment stayed with me. It felt like the closing of a circle, like she finally understood the weight of motherhood, the quiet sacrifices I made without ever demanding recognition. After her maternity leave, I stepped in to help with childcare. 3 days a week, I picked Eli up from daycare, took him to the park, made him dinner, and stayed until bedtime so Marissa could catch up on work. She used to text me in the evenings, "Couldn't do this without you, Mom." I'd smile and save those messages. They meant more than flowers or cards. Weekends were ours. Sunday brunches, little shopping trips, movie nights with Eli. We laughed a lot, especially over shared memories of Marissa's teenage drama. She'd tease me for still using a flip phone, and I'd roll my eyes when she called avocado toast a meal. It was warm, familiar. I genuinely believed I was a part of her life. Not just a helper or babysitter, but someone she still leaned on, still respected. I even planned to leave everything to her when I was gone: the house, the savings, my jewelry box that held every heirloom from 4 generations of women in our family. I imagined her someday opening it with Eli beside her, telling him stories about his grandmother who taught her how to stand tall. Back then, Marissa made space for me in her home, her conversations, and her world. I wasn't just a mother, I was her person. We didn't always agree, but there was never a time she made me feel like I was in the way. Even when she got busy, she'd call to ask how I was or stop by with Eli just because he wanted Grandma's grilled cheese. It was the kind of rhythm you don't notice until it falters, small gestures that build a life. A shared favorite show, leftovers wrapped just the way I liked birthday cards signed, "Love you more than coffee." If this story made you feel something, comment 1, if not, comment 0. I clung to those moments for a long time, even when things began to subtly shift. I told myself it was temporary, just stress, a rough patch. People change, but love doesn't vanish, at least not overnight. But looking back now, I can see how slowly I was being moved to the edges, like a favorite photo frame, placed on a higher shelf, still there, but harder to reach. I was the one adjusting, I was the one bending, forgiving, stepping back, because that's what mothers do. And for a while, I told myself that was enough. It was subtle, so subtle that if I hadn't replayed it 100 times in my head, later I might have missed it completely. Marissa had invited me to brunch at her house. Nothing fancy, just her mark. A few coworkers she'd recently grown close to, and me. I made my usual fruit tart, the one Marissa used to request on her birthdays when she was little. I arrived a little early to help set the table, wipe down the counters, and keep Eli entertained while she finished cooking. She barely looked up when I came in, just gestured toward the stack of plates and said, "Can you set those on the patio?" Everyone gathered around the outdoor table, mimosas in hand, laughing about deadlines and some conference in Atlanta. It was a crowd. Marissa seemed eager to impress. Crisp suits, glossy smiles, always scrolling their phones. I didn't fit into that world, but I didn't mind. I was there for her, not them. At one point, Eli wandered over and started fiddling with a nearby bug zapper. I gently reached out and said, "Sweetheart, don't touch that. It could be dangerous." Marissa's head whipped around. "Mom, please, he's fine." She chuckled, but it wasn't warm. It was performative, like she wanted to show the others she wasn't some overprotective parent. One of her coworkers laughed and added, "Kids these days are practically indestructible." Marissa grinned and raised her glass. "Exactly. And besides, my mom still thinks it's the 80s. Everything's a hazard." The group laughed again. I smiled, but I felt the shift. Not just the words, but the way she said, my mom distant, slightly amused, like I was a relic from a time she no longer needed. It was the kind of joke that people laugh at because it's safe, not because it's kind. Later, while clearing the table, I brought up a family trip we'd taken when Marissa was 10, just a story about her trying to smuggle seashells through airport security, something light. Before I even finished, she waved her hand and said, "Oh God, not this one." Again, I froze for a second. She used to love that story. She used to laugh and beg me to tell it to Eli, like it was some family legend. But now it was tired, embarrassing, disposable. I excused myself to the kitchen, told her I needed to get the tart out of the fridge. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, staring at the old fridge magnets Eli had made in kindergarten, my face drawn in bright crayon colors, with Best Grammy scribbled underneath. When I came back outside, the conversation had shifted. They were talking about a project Marissa was leading, something big. One of the women turned to me and said, "You must be proud of her." I smiled and said, "Always. She's worked so hard Marissa didn't even look up. She just reached for her drink and said she tries to take credit for my work ethic, but it's all me." The others laughed again, and I laughed too, but softer, not because it was funny, but because I didn't want to seem bitter. I didn't want to ruin the image of the supportive, agreeable mom who knew her place. That night after the guests had left and I was gathering my things, I stood at the doorway and turned to her. "You were a little sharp with me today." I said gently, "I wasn't trying to embarrass you." She didn't apologize. She didn't even hesitate. "Mom, you overstepped. Sometimes I need you to trust that I've got things handled." I nodded, of course, but something inside me felt bruised, not broken, not yet, but the first mark had been made. And like all bruises, I knew it would deepen with time. That was the first time I realized that maybe my role in her life wasn't as permanent as I thought. Not sacred, not untouchable, just optional. After that brunch, the changes came slowly, almost politely. There were no harsh words, no screaming matches, just a quiet withdrawal that crept in like fog. One day, I was her mother, her helper, her safety net, and then without warning, I was something else entirely, a presence to manage. At first, I made excuses for her. "She's busy with work," I'd tell myself when days passed without a call. "She's tired," I'd reason when our conversations became short, transactional, clipped. But deep down, I knew I could feel it in the way she rushed off the phone, how she started replying to my messages with short thumbs up emojis instead of actual words. The biggest shift came with Eli. I had always picked him up from daycare on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It was our time. We'd go to the park, feed ducks, make silly faces during dinner. But one Tuesday I arrived and found out from the receptionist that Marissa had already picked him up. No text, no heads up, just silence. I called her more confused than upset. She answered, after a few rings distracted, "Oh yeah, I meant to tell you, my new assistant said she could grab him this week. We're just trying to adjust our schedule." I paused. "So am I not doing pickups anymore?" There was a beat of silence then, her voice softened into that performative patience. I was beginning to recognize Mom. It's not a big deal. We're just trying something new. Don't overthink it. Okay, but I did overthink it. I thought about it all night. I lay in bed, replaying every pickup, every peanut butter sandwich I'd made, every story I read to Eli on that old beige couch in their living room. None of it seemed to matter now. Then came the holidays. That year, Thanksgiving was a little hectic. Marissa said she and Mark were traveling to Napa with some of his colleagues. Christmas, she explained, was going to be just the three of us this year. She promised a call, but the call never came. I spent Christmas morning watching a rerun of It's a Wonderful Life with my cat curled in my lap, and a half-cooked ham I couldn't bring myself to finish. I was no longer invited to birthdays either. Marissa started saying Eli preferred low-key celebrations, but photos would later pop up on line parties filled with balloons and caterers and strangers. Not once did I see a picture of the old rocking horse I'd restored from Marissa's childhood, the one Eli used to adore. I asked about it once. She shrugged and said they donated it during their last garage purge. One afternoon in March, I dropped off a bag of homemade soup because I'd heard Eli had the flu. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. Later, I got a text, "Thanks, Mom left it on the porch." Right. Appreciate it. No invitation inside, no update on how he was doing, just a text, the kind I might have sent a neighbor. I wish I could say I confronted her, then that I asked her what I'd done, why she was pushing me away, why everything felt so hollow. But I didn't. I kept waiting for it to pass, for things to return to normal, for her to wake up and realize what she was doing. Instead, I started shrinking. I stopped suggesting dinner plans. I stopped offering to help. I stopped texting unless she reached out first, which rarely happened. Every time I reached for the phone, I hesitated. I felt like an inconvenience, a reminder of something she no longer wanted in her orbit. The woman who once called me 3 times a day when Eli was teething now barely looked me in the eye when we crossed paths. Even at church, people began to ask, "How's your daughter? Haven't seen her in a while." I learned to smile through it. Busy, I'd say she's doing great, and then I'd excuse myself, step into the restroom, and sit quietly in the stall until the knot in my throat loosened. There's a certain pain in becoming invisible to someone you helped shape, a kind of grief that doesn't get a funeral, no closure, no final goodbye, just distance and silence. And so, little by little, I stopped showing up. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of crisp fall night that used to mean chili on the stove, and Eli curled up on the couch under a blanket I'd knitted when Marissa was pregnant. But that night I found myself sitting stiffly on the edge of their sofa, unsure of why I was even invited. Marissa had texted me earlier in the week hosting a little dinner. Tuesday, some of Mark's partners and their wives come. If you're free, there was no warmth in it, but no clear rejection either. Just neutral, like she was extending a courtesy more than actually wanting me there. But I still said yes. Maybe a part of me hoped this would be a sign things were turning around, that maybe I had been too sensitive, that maybe I'd walk in and she'd greet me with a hug like she used to. She didn't. When I arrived, the door was already cracked open. I stepped in and called out, "Hello!" From the kitchen, I heard Marissa's voice, distracted and rushed. "Yeah, just come in." Mom were in the dining room. I placed the bottle of wine I brought on the counter. No one acknowledged it. I looked around the room. It was beautiful, perfectly arranged candles lit modern and stylish in a way that made it feel more like a showroom than a home. I walked into the dining area where 6 other people were already seated. Everyone looked polished, expensive, at ease. Marissa introduced me with a casual wave. "This is my mom, Lena." One of the women smiled politely. "Oh, you're the one who taught English, right?" I nodded yes for 32 years. I retired a couple of years ago. "She used to write all my essays in high school," Marissa added with a chuckle. "She'd call it editing, but let's be real." The table laughed. It was harmless on the surface, but I felt the sting. I didn't write her papers, I reviewed them. I taught her to think for herself, to write with purpose. I said nothing. I smiled. Dinner went on conversation, buzzed with promotions, market trends, and home renovations. I mostly listened. I tried to jump in. Once, mentioning a book, I just finished a memoir by a woman who rebuilt her life. after divorce. It was sharp, inspiring. I thought it would land. Marissa interrupted before I got past the title. Mom, can we not? This isn't book club. She said it with a half smile, but her voice had an edge, the kind that sliced deeper because it was meant to sound light. There was a pause, awkward, small, but enough. One of the men cleared his throat and changed the subject. I felt my face flush. I pushed a pea around my plate with my fork, suddenly very aware of my posture, my age, my place. I stayed quiet the rest of the night. After dinner, while helping gather plates, I reached to adjust the floral centerpiece a bit too large, blocking people's view. Marissa moved quickly and said under her breath, "Don't I paid someone to design this, just leave it." It was so sharp, so final, that I almost dropped the plate in my hand. We stood in the kitchen, just the two of us, for a moment. I looked at her, trying to find the girl who used to fall asleep in my lap, the one who cried when I forgot to kiss her goodnight, the one who used to beg for my advice. "Marissa," I started softly, "I don't know what I did wrong," but she didn't let me finish, Mom. "You didn't do anything wrong. You're just too much. Sometimes you have to understand that not everything needs your input. Just let us do things our way." There, it was direct, punctuated, brutally clear. I stood there stunned, blinking. She looked right at me, waiting for a reaction. I gave her none. Instead, I smiled, that same careful smile I'd worn before, the one that says, "I hear you even when the words feel like poison." I collected my purse, kissed Eli goodnight on his forehead. He was already half asleep on the couch, and let myself out. If this story made you feel something, comment 1, if not, comment zeros. I drove home in silence, my hands tight on the wheel. The road ahead was dim, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to figure out how to fix it. I was just driving forward because something in me, something quiet, steady, and long-suffering, had started to wake up. The morning after that dinner, I woke up to the smell of old lavender and the familiar creak of my bedroom floor as I rose. The house was quiet, filled with framed memories, Marissa's kindergarten drawing of us, a photo of Jack laughing in the garden, Eli's smudged watercolor stuck to the fridge. These walls held our history, but lately they felt like a museum of someone else's life. I walked to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat at the table where Marissa used to do her homework. I stared out the window at the empty swing in the backyard. I couldn't stop hearing her voice. "You're just too much. Sometimes not everything needs your input. Let us do things our way." It wasn't the words that broke me. It was the ease with which she said them, like she'd rehearsed it, like it was overdue. For most of my adult life, I had been necessary. I was the person who showed up, who brought soup when she was sick, who stayed up late sewing costumes for school plays, who took late-night phone calls during breakups and career breakdowns I had given and given and given, not because I expected praise, but because I believed that's what love did. Love showed up. But now I was a burden, an accessory she brought out when it suited her image of family and tucked away when it didn't. I didn't confront her. I didn't send a long text or schedule a talk. I just stepped back quietly, completely. That week, I returned the spare key she'd given me years ago, slipped it in an envelope, left it in her mailbox. No note. When Eli's school had a grandparents' luncheon, I didn't RSVP, I saw photos. Later, Marissa had brought Mark's mother instead. She looked lovely, dressed in navy, holding Eli's hand. That used to be me. I stopped offering to pick him up from practice. I didn't ask if they needed help on weekends. I didn't offer advice when I heard through a mutual friend that Marissa had been passed over for a promotion. I simply let her be. I let them all be. Judith, my sister-in-law, called me a few days later. She said, "You okay? You haven't mentioned Marissa in weeks." I paused. I think I'm learning how to let go of someone who's already let go of me. Judith didn't say anything for a few moments. Then she sighed. "Took you long enough. That made me laugh." Not a full laugh, but the kind that feels more like breathing after being underwater. The thing is, I didn't leave with anger. I didn't stomp or scream or write long letters explaining how hurt I was. I left with exhaustion, the kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep, the kind that seeps into your bones when you've been shrinking yourself for too long in someone else's life. I began living. I stopped rearranging my days around Marissa's needs. I canceled a standing alert on my phone that reminded me to check in with Marissa. I deleted the folder of recipes I'd been collecting to pass down to her. Instead, I started reading more real books, thick ones I never had time for when I was too busy managing everyone else's schedule. I went to the community center and signed up for a watercolor class. I even visited Judith for a weekend retreat where we sat by the lake and talked about our husbands, our youth, and all the invisible labor women carry until we finally put it down. One afternoon, while clearing out the attic, I found the old baby blanket I had crocheted before Marissa was born. I sat down, ran my fingers along the stitching, and didn't cry, not because I wasn't sad, but because I had nothing left to grieve. I had done my part. I folded the blanket, gently placed it in a box labeled Memories, and packed it away. Marissa never called to ask why I stopped coming around. She didn't ask why I didn't bring gifts for Eli's birthday, why I didn't send reminders for dentist appointments, or drop off soup during flu season. Maybe she noticed, maybe she didn't, but she said nothing. And for the first time in my life, neither did I. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, it comes from being erased. The house felt too big those days, not in square footage, but in memory. Every corner whispered reminders. The hallway mirror still reflected the woman who used to braid Marissa's hair, before school still bore the smudge of Eli's handprint from the last time he ran through the hallway. But now it all felt frozen in time, like the life that once pulsed here had been drained out in silence. I spent entire days not speaking a single word out loud. I no longer had anyone to call in the evenings, no dinner plans to shop for, no birthdays to plan around. My phone stayed quiet, save for promotional texts or appointment reminders. I began to hate the ding of a notification, not because it came, but because it never came from her. One Saturday, I went to the local farmer's market alone. I used to take Eli with me. He'd beg for kettle corn and try every apple sample with serious commentary as if he were a fruit sommelier. That day I stood by a honey booth, staring at a jar I knew he once loved, and felt tears build behind my eyes. I blinked them back before anyone could see. I walked home with an empty tote bag. Nights were the worst. I'd sit on the edge of my bed, holding my phone thumb hovering over her contact. Sometimes I'd scroll through our old text threads, reading the little messages that used to feel like lifelines. Thanks for picking him up. You're the best mom, couldn't do this without you. Now, those words read like echoes from a stranger. I tried to fill the space. I joined a knitting circle at the local church, but I felt out of place, like I didn't have the right kind of sorrow. Some women had lost husbands, others were battling illness. My grief was different. It was invisible. No one brings casseroles when your daughter decides you're no longer needed. One morning, I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. My hair was unbrushed, my eyes were tired, my shoulders slouched in a way they never had before. I looked like someone who had been waiting too long for someone to love her again. That afternoon, I opened a closet and pulled out a box labeled Marissa. Inside were dozens of keepsakes, a hospital bracelet from her birth, her kindergarten report card, photos of us baking together in flower-covered aprons. I pulled out a drawing she made when she was 6. 2 stick figures holding hands labeled me and Mommy. My breath caught in my throat. What changed? I wasn't a perfect mother. I knew that I had my flaws. I worried too much, gave advice, too freely hovered when I should have stepped back. But everything I did came from love, a fierce, unrelenting love. And now it felt like none of it mattered. Like the person I'd loved, the longest had decided I was disposable. I sat on the floor for a long time, with that drawing in my hands. Hours passed, the light in the room shifted from warm gold to gray. I didn't move, I didn't cry, I just sat. That was my lowest point, not the loneliness, not the silence, but the realization that I had spent 62 years giving, and now had no one who even asked how I was doing. That night, I didn't eat dinner, I didn't turn on the TV, I simply went to bed. And before I closed my eyes, I whispered into the dark, I can't keep living like this, not as a plea, not a surrender, as a promise. Something had to change, because the woman I'd become quiet, overlooked. Waiting was not who I was meant to be. I didn't know what the next step would be. I didn't have a plan, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not spend the rest of my life mourning someone who was still alive. The change didn't come with a grand revelation or a lightning bolt of clarity. It came quietly on a rainy Thursday. I had decided to clean out the small filing cabinet tucked away in the corner of my bedroom, the one I hadn't opened in years. It was packed with old bank statements, insurance forms, expired warranties, and manila envelopes that had yellowed at the corners. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just needed to do something, anything. I sifted through papers mechanically until my hand landed on a dark green folder. Thicker than the rest, I pulled it out and felt the weight of its contents before I even opened it. My will, the one I drafted nearly a decade ago, back when I had no doubt who everything would go to. I opened it slowly as if it might say something different. Now, there it was in clean black ink, primary beneficiary, Marissa J. Darrow, secondary beneficiary, Eli R. Darrow to inherit and trust until the age of 25, my house, my savings, my grandmother's wedding ring, the antique mirror in the hallway, my pension, my jewelry box, everything. Each line was a love letter she'd never read, a lifetime of sacrifices documented in legal terms I had planned for her to have it all, believing she would carry forward the legacy with care and gratitude, believing that everything I had, even what little it was, would mean something to her. But now I couldn't even get a call on Christmas. Now I was the family ghost, someone she referenced when needed and ignored the rest of the time. As I stared at her name on that page, something shifted inside me, not in anger, not in spite. It was like seeing the truth for the first time, plain and undeniable. This woman, the one I had poured myself into, no longer saw me as vital to her life. She had grown into someone who tolerated me, not someone who valued me. And yet here I was, still gifting her everything I'd worked for, even in death. I set the will down and looked around my room. The shelves were full of reminders of who I'd been, a mother, a teacher, a woman who once believed her love could never be outgrown. I realized I had been waiting for permission to take my life back, but I didn't need it, not from her, not from anyone. Later that evening, I opened a storage chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were a few things I hadn't looked at in years, old photos, keepsakes, and a letter my husband Jack had written me on our 15th anniversary. He died 2 years later. I'd kept that letter because of the final line, no matter what happens, Lena, never forget that you were never made to be invisible. That sentence stopped me cold. Invisible, that was exactly what I had become, not just to Marissa, but to myself. I had whittled myself down into service and silence, and for what? I pulled out my laptop and searched for Tom, my old attorney. He had retired, but his firm was still active. I left a message requesting an appointment. Then I sat back, closed the folder, and set it aside. Something had clicked. The discovery wasn't just the will, it was a realization that my love, while unconditional, did not have to be unreciprocated. That planning for a future where everything I owned went to someone who couldn't be bothered to include me in a Tuesday dinner was not a loving act. It was self-erasure. The next morning, I woke up with a quiet resolve I hadn't felt in years. I made breakfast for myself, not toast, not something quick, but a full plate, scrambled eggs, fresh fruit tea in a real cup. I played my favorite Ella Fitzgerald record while I ate, letting the music fill the corners of the house that had grown so still. Then I pulled out a notebook and started writing, not letters to Marissa, not explanations, just thoughts. What mattered to me? What legacy I wanted to leave behind? Names of charities I admired, notes about Eli, the boy I still believed in, even if I could no longer reach him. The will had been my final gift, but now I was rethinking what kind of gift I wanted to leave and for whom. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something unfamiliar rising in me again, a sense of direction, of quiet, deliberate purpose. Something had changed in me, but I didn't rush it. I let it settle, like fog, lifting slowly to reveal a road I hadn't seen in years. The morning after I found my will, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself with new eyes. I didn't look younger. I didn't look stronger. But I looked awake for the first time in years. The woman staring back at me wasn't just existing for other people. She looked like someone who had remembered she had a name, Lena, not mom, not grandma, Not could you just, or would you mind just Lena? I spent that morning doing something I hadn't done in years. I dressed up for myself. Nothing extravagant, just a soft blue blouse I used to wear on the first day of school when I taught. It still fit a little snug around the waist, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw her again, the woman who used to stand at a chalkboard and speak with purpose, who used to command a room with stories. And Shakespeare, I made a cup of tea and stepped outside into the small garden in my backyard. The roses were blooming again, delicate and persistent. I clipped a few and placed them in a vase by the window. I didn't do it for guests or for company or for family. I did it because I wanted beauty in my own space. If this story made you feel something, comment 1, if not, comment 0. That week, I pulled out an old box of hobbies I'd abandoned. I painted again, not well, but freely. I walked through the park without looking at my phone. I browsed the library and let myself wander through shelves like I used to when Marissa was small and would sit beside me reading Goodnight Moon on the carpeted floor. And I started to remember things, not memories of Marissa, not yet, but of me, the girl who wanted to be a writer, once the teenager who spent her weekends volunteering at a local shelter, the young mother who still found time to journal after midnight, back when Jack would sleep with his hand resting gently on her hip. I even dug out the dusty keyboard from the guest room closet and started playing again. I wasn't good. I fumbled through the same song a dozen times, but I smiled every time I hit the right notes because they were mine. There was a moment that sealed it, though a small unexpected moment that told me the shift wasn't just emotional, it was permanent. I was walking through the grocery store and ran into Mrs. Engel, an old neighbor from the block we used to live on when Marissa was a teenager. Her hair was thinner, but her voice hadn't changed. We chatted for a while, small talk, updates, polite laughter. Then she said, "How's Marissa still keeping you busy?" I paused, but I didn't flinch. "We haven't seen each other in a bit," I said calmly, "but I've started painting again, and I'm looking into traveling next spring. I'm thinking about Ireland." She smiled, nodded, and said, "It's good to hear you're doing things for yourself." That was the word yourself. I hadn't heard that in years. That night, I made myself a glass of wine and sat on the back porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The stars were faint, but they were there. And for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting on anyone. Not for a call, not for an apology, not for an invitation. I was done waiting. I realized that somewhere in my grief, I had forgotten that my life had always been mine, that being a mother had been a chapter, a beautiful, brutal, selfless chapter, but not the whole story. I still had more to write. I didn't plan revenge, I didn't draft messages or rehearse confrontations. I simply started living differently, quieter, stronger, not loud, not spiteful, just awake. And in that stillness, I began to heal. I never said a word to Marissa about what I was planning. There were no dramatic speeches, no scathing letters, no late night calls filled with accusations. I had done all the talking I ever would. What I did now, I did quietly, not to prove a point, but to reclaim a life that had been mine all along. It started with small acts that probably seemed insignificant from the outside, but were monumental to me. I changed my bank account's beneficiary. I opened a new savings account in a credit union she didn't know existed. I met with a financial planner, a kind woman named Erica, who specialized in estate restructuring. She didn't ask too many questions when I said I wanted to reevaluate my legacy. She just listened, explained options, and nodded with a calm, firm understanding. We revised everything, not just the will, but the intentions behind it. I told Erica I wanted Eli to have something, but only if certain conditions were met. I didn't want my name to be remembered as a source of entitlement. I wanted it to mean something. I set up a trust to be accessed by Eli only after the age of 25, provided he completed some kind of education, trade, university, anything, and I named my late husband's sister Judith as the trustee. She was the only one I still trusted to honor my wishes. The house, which had always been intended for Marissa, I redirected to a program that provided transitional housing for single mothers. It wasn't out of spite, it was full circle. The home that had carried me through years of sacrifice could now carry someone else, someone who hadn't had the chances Marissa had squandered. The most painful decision was the jewelry. I held each piece in my hand before letting it go. My mother's pearls, my grandmother's brooch, the wedding ring Jack placed on my finger. All those years ago, I donated most of them to a women's shelter's fundraising auction, and the rest I packaged into a small velvet box, not for Marissa, but for Eli. I included a letter that he'd receive one day, not a bitter letter, but one filled with truth about who I was, about how much I loved him, about how love sometimes comes in quiet protection, not loud indulgence. Each day, I made a new decision, quiet, private, powerful. I didn't post any of it online. I didn't talk about it at book club. I didn't even tell Judith right away. I simply kept moving one intentional step at a time. When the legal revisions were done, my attorney Tom Still Sharp, despite his semi-retirement, looked at me across his desk and said, "You sure about this, Lena?" I smiled and nodded completely. He leaned back and gave a soft laugh. Most people who do this are still trying to send a message. I'm not sending anything. I said calmly, I'm just done, weighting the matter. After leaving his office, I stopped at a small cafe I hadn't visited in years. I ordered a latte, sat by the window, and opened my notebook. I began listing all the places I wanted to visit before I turned 70. Nothing extravagant, no five-star resorts or world cruises, just small, beautiful places, the Grand Canyon, a cabin in Vermont, the bookstore in Boston. Jack always wanted to see places that reminded me that I still had more life left to live. At home, I boxed up old reminders. I removed Marissa's framed college diploma from the hallway and replaced it with a print of an abstract painting I bought from a local artist. I took down the calendar with Eli's school events I was never invited to. I deleted the annual reminder that read Marissa's Mother's Day gift. I didn't need to be reminded anymore. This wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. I wasn't plotting revenge, I was creating peace. And perhaps the most liberating part of it all was that Marissa had no idea. She thought the distance was passivity. She thought I just faded into the background, like a dim light left on out of habit, but I wasn't dim, I was deliberate. And while she went about her life certain that I was still sitting in the corner, waiting for a place at her table, I was quietly building a new table of my own, one she might never be invited to. At first, the changes didn't seem to register with Marissa, or if they did, she didn't say anything. Maybe she assumed I was simply going through a phase, a quiet rebellion she could ignore, until I came back around, softened and ready to resume my role as the ever-available mother. But I wasn't rebelling, I wasn't angry, I was simply done. It started with a missed favor. She called one Thursday afternoon while I was in the middle of my watercolor class, a new routine I had grown to love. "Hey," she said, tone-clipped, "can you pick up Eli from school today? Mark and I are stuck at work." I paused, looking out the studio window at the rain falling softly over the parking lot. I felt no guilt. "Sorry, I'm in the middle of something," I replied. "You might want to try Judith. She mentioned she was free this week." There was a long silence on the other end. "Right, okay, I'll figure it out." And she did. The world didn't collapse because I wasn't there to catch the pieces, and I didn't feel bad about it. I went back to painting a soft lilac flower, a little off-center, but beautiful all the same. Then came the weekend gathering. It used to be a given that I would bring dessert my lemon chess pie, the one that had become tradition. I heard about the gathering secondhand from Judith, who'd been invited. No one called me. I didn't offer the pie. I spent that Sunday walking through the botanical gardens instead, breathing in the clean air, watching strangers smile at one another without expectation. Days passed, then a week, and slowly I began to notice something had shifted, not just in me, but in her. She began calling more often, not to chat, but to ask, "Did you get the Christmas lights up? Yet are you still going to come with us to the tree farm this year?" I was thinking of making that stuffing. You do what's in it again. Each time I answered, honestly, but without overextending myself. I didn't jump to say yes. I didn't offer extras. I was polite, clear, calm. And the more boundaries I held, the more confused she became. Once she texted, "Hey, I haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" I stared at that message for a long time. Everything was finally okay, because for the first time I wasn't scrambling to earn her love. I was living in mine. The real turning point came during a family brunch organized by her in-laws. I went mostly for Eli's sake. He ran to hug me when I walked in, that same light in his eyes that reminded me not everything had been lost, But Marissa, she looked startled, almost nervous, like my presence meant something different. Now, like she could feel I was no longer orbiting her life. Throughout the meal, I smiled, made small talk, and didn't insert myself. I didn't offer to help in the kitchen. I didn't try to smooth over tension. When Marissa snapped at Mark, I wasn't cold, I was simply separate, and I could feel her noticing it. After dessert, as people were mingling and packing leftovers, she pulled me aside. "You've been different lately," she said, studying me. I smiled. "I guess I have. Is something wrong?" "No," I said, holding her gaze, just choosing to spend my time a little differently these days. She opened her mouth like she might say more, but then stopped. And in that pause, in that subtle uncertainty, I felt it, the shift. For so long, I had lived on the edges of her approval, but now she was the one unsure, she was the one reaching, measuring, wondering how much of me she still had access to. My silence had become stronger than my words ever were. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need her to notice, but she had, and it unsettled her more than any confrontation ever could. That night, I returned home to my quiet house, lit a candle, and played one of my husband's old jazz records. I stood by the window sipping tea and thought, this is what it feels like to stand in your own life, not waiting, not chasing, just standing steady, grounded, whole. It wasn't planned. There was no dramatic orchestration, no audience waiting with bated breath. Just a phone call, a calendar reminder, and a room. My lawyer, Tom, had called a week earlier. "Lena, everything's finalized. All documents are signed and notarized. You said you wanted a reading of the will. Are you still set on that?" "Yes," I replied. "I want it done while I'm still here to look them in the eye." Tom didn't question it. He simply set a date and promised discretion. I requested one thing, that Marissa, Mark, Judith, and Eli be present, not because I needed to make a scene, but because I wanted clarity. No misinterpretations, no whispered accusations later on, just the truth spoken once. Marissa's voice on the phone had been hesitant when I invited her. "You're doing a will reading. Now you're not sick, are you?" "No, but I've made changes and I want to make sure everyone understands what's in place." "Oh," she said, unsure. Okay, the day arrived. I wore a navy sweater and slacks. The same outfit I used to wear for parent-teacher conferences, not formal but composed, meant to remind people that I was someone who had things to say and a reason to be heard. The room at Tom's office was modest, a long table, chairs, a pitcher of water with neatly stacked glasses. Eli fidgeted next to Marissa, who sat across from me, her expression unreadable. Mark looked bored. Judith beside me gave my hand a quiet squeeze. Tom began, "Thank you all for coming. Lena has asked that I read through her final will and testament so that there is no confusion moving forward." He didn't dramatize it. He simply read. Marissa's name never came up. Her eyes narrowed at first, then her brows pulled together in a soft frown. She leaned forward slightly, waiting, but every bequest, the house, the accounts, the personal belongings, was designated elsewhere. Judith was named as executor. The house was to be donated. The jewelry had been divided between charitable auctions and a trust. The savings were to fund scholarships for single mothers pursuing teaching degrees. Eli's trust was outlined, carefully delayed access, educational milestones with Judith as guardian of its conditions. Marissa sat up straighter. The silence in the room grew heavy. "If this story made you feel something, comment 1, if not comment 0. When it was over, Tom folded the folder closed and looked at me. "Lena, would you like to say anything?" I turned to my daughter. Her face was pale, her lips parted slightly in disbelief. Mark leaned away from her, as if he wanted no part of what came next. I took a breath. "I didn't do this to punish you." I said, "This isn't revenge. This is recognition of the years I showed up, the years I waited, the moments I was dismissed." Marissa opened her mouth, but I gently raised a hand to stop her. "No, let me finish, because this is the only time we're going to have this conversation." She closed her mouth, her hands clenched in her lap. "I loved you, Marissa, more than anything, but somewhere along the line, I stopped being a person to you. I became a tool, something to use, when convenient to ignore, when inconvenient. I forgave that for a long time. I made excuses for you. I took pride in your success, even when you pretended I had no part in it, but I'm not going to pretend anymore." I looked at Eli. Then his young face torn, confused, maybe even scared, but I softened my voice. Eli, if you're hearing this years from now, I hope you know it was never about cutting people off. It was about honoring myself. I still believe in you. That's why you're part of this, but love, real love, isn't just about biology or obligation. It's about respect and boundaries. I turned back to Marissa. I'm not angry anymore, but I've made peace with the life I lived and the woman I became. This is the legacy I want to leave. The silence after that was thick. Marissa looked as if she'd been slapped, but I saw it, the flicker in her eyes. Not hatred, not defiance, something else, recognition. She stood abruptly. I need some air. Without another word, she walked out. Mark followed. A few seconds later. Judith placed a hand on my shoulder. Eli looked at me, then quietly stood and walked over. He didn't say anything, just hugged me tightly without words. That was the moment, not the reading, not the silence, but that hug, that quiet acknowledgement from the one person who might still grow into something different. And in that instant, I felt no regret. A week passed after the will reading, and I didn't hear a word from Marissa. Not a call, not a message, not even a cold line of protest through Judith. I wasn't surprised. She'd always used silence as a tool, a way to assert control without getting her hands dirty. But this time, it didn't work. This time, her silence felt small. Then late on a Friday evening, my phone buzzed 6 times in a row, 6 missed calls, all from her. I watched the screen light up from across the kitchen as I wiped down the counter. The name Marissa glowed in sharp white letters, pulsing with urgency. I didn't pick up, not the first time, not the second. Not even when she texted, "We need to talk, please." She never used the word, please. I turned the phone over and let the screen go black. The next morning, I drove out to a small trail Jack and I used to hike before his stroke. It was shaded by sycamores and opened up to a modest overlook where you could see the river carving quietly through the hills. I brought a small thermos of coffee, a notebook, and my peace. I hadn't felt so grounded in years. When I got home, there was a thick envelope waiting at the front door, hand-delivered, no postage. My name written in Marissa's precise handwriting. Inside, I found a printed letter, 3 pages long. She had typed it, every paragraph tightly worded, as if edited and re-edited. She was trying to be careful. The letter began with a defense. I didn't realize how distant I'd become. I was overwhelmed, and maybe I expected too much from you. Without thinking about what you needed, I never meant to make you feel discarded. Then came the justification. You were always so strong, I thought you didn't need anything. You were there no matter what. I assumed you always would be. And finally, the plea, I didn't expect to be left out. I was shocked. Can we talk? I think we both made mistakes. This doesn't feel right. What she meant, I realized, was that not having control didn't feel right to her, that my silence had disrupted a system she'd come to rely on, one where she set the terms and I absorbed the costs. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer next to the legal copy of the new will. I didn't respond. That same weekend, I received a call from the director of the women's shelter where I donated most of my jewelry. Miss Darrow, she said, her voice thick with gratitude. Your pieces raised over $18,000 at our gala. That's going to house 3 mothers and their children for 6 months. I sat down in my chair, hand trembling slightly. 3 mothers, 6 months of stability. 3 lives changed, not because I left something behind, but because I chose who to uplift. That was justice, not vengeance, not punishment, but legacy redirected to where it would grow. Later that evening, as I watched the sun dip behind the neighbor's fence, my phone buzzed again, this time a message from Mark. I know things are tense, but I just wanted to say, I read the trust paperwork you've done right by Eli, whether or not Marissa sees it. I do. That surprised me. Mark had always played the quiet role, supportive, distant diplomatic. But this felt different, like acknowledgement, like respect. I typed a short reply, "Thank you, that means more than you know." After that, I didn't hear from Marissa again, and oddly, that was fine. For the first time, her absence didn't ache. It gave space for other things to bloom. I started volunteering once a week at the literacy center. Downtown, I reconnected with an old college friend who invited me to stay with her in Maine for a long overdue reunion. And Eli, He began writing me letters, not emails, not texts, real handwritten letters. He told me about a book he liked, about a poem he'd written in school, about how he missed my French toast. He signed the first letter, "Love you, Grandma, I always will." That was the final justice, not what Marissa lost, but what I gained. Not a courtroom victory, not a headline. Worthy twist, just a life, reclaimed a legacy, reimagined a quiet correction, decades in the making. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I was in the middle of trimming the rose bushes, those same stubborn plants Jack had planted the first spring we bought the house, and had mud on my gloves and sweat on my brow. I figured it was a neighbor or a delivery, but when I opened the door, it was Eli. He stood there, backpack slung over one shoulder, his hair a little longer than I remembered. He looked older, not just in age, but in something deeper, something in his eyes, a seriousness that didn't belong to a 10-year-old. "Hi, Grandma," he said, soft and unsure. I blinked, stunned. "Eli, what does your mom know you're here?" He nodded. "She dropped me off, said I could stay the weekend if it's okay with you." I stepped aside instinctively. Of course it's okay. He walked in like he'd never left, kicking off his shoes in the same spot by the rug where they always ended up. Before I closed the door, I looked out, half expecting to see Marissa, but the driveway was empty. I closed the door slowly, unsure whether to feel grateful or suspicious. Or both. Marissa had been silent for weeks since the will reading, and now, suddenly, it didn't feel random. I watched Eli wander into the living room and sit cross-legged on the floor beside the old bookshelf I had restocked recently with children's books, just in case he pulled one out, grinning. "You still have the monster. At the end of this book, I kept all your favorites," I said, my voice catching in my throat. Over the next few hours, we slipped easily into old rhythms. We made grilled cheese with the crust cut off. He asked to watch an old animated movie we used to laugh through together. We played cards, and I let him win half the time, maybe a little more than half. When I asked him if he wanted to call his mom before bed, he shook his head. "She said to call if I needed to," he said, "but I'm good." That night, as I tucked him into the guest bed, now made up with fresh sheets and a soft nightlight, he looked up at me and said, "Mom's been crying a lot lately." I paused. "Has she talked to you about why?" He nodded. "She said she messed up, that you're mad at her." I knelt beside the bed and smoothed the blanket over his chest. "I'm not mad at her. Eli, I'm sad and tired. Sometimes grown-ups forget how to say what they feel, and sometimes they say things they can't take back." He was quiet a moment before asking, "Do you still love her?" The question was simple, the answer wasn't, but I nodded. "I do, I always will. But love doesn't always mean things go back to the way they were." He didn't say anything, but he reached out and squeezed my hand. I kissed his forehead and turned out the light. The next morning, I found a note slid under the front door. It was from Marissa. "I didn't know how to say this face to face. I'm not asking for everything to go back to the way it was. I wanted him to see you. I wanted him to feel what I forgot to appreciate. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope in time you'll let me try again." I read the note 3 times before setting it on the counter. I didn't cry. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt calm. Later that day, Eli and I made cookies together. He cracked the eggs too hard and got shell bits in the dough, and I pretended not to notice. He asked if he could come again next weekend, and I said yes. When Marissa pulled up Sunday evening, she didn't get out of the car. Eli hugged me tightly, then ran toward her. She waved from behind the windshield, a small, cautious wave. I returned it with a nod. We didn't speak. There was no dramatic apology, no movie-style embrace, just 2 women, one inside a house and one inside a car, with years of history between them and no clear map for what came next. But that was okay. I didn't need her to fix everything. I didn't need an apology wrapped in tears and promises. What I needed, what I finally had, was peace, and a quiet kind of strength that didn't rely on anyone's approval. She had broken something in me once, but I had rebuilt it brick by quiet brick. It was early spring when I stood in my backyard garden pruning the roses that had made it through winter. The air was soft, filled with the scent of damp earth and the faint hum of bees returning to their work. I wore a straw hat Jack had bought me years ago at a farmer's market, and my gloves were stained with the memory of every growing season that had come before. I clipped a single rose pale pink edges slightly curled and held it in my hand just long enough to admire how stubborn and beautiful something could be after surviving so much cold. That flower felt like me. Life hadn't returned to what it once was, but I had stopped trying to bend time backward. I didn't want the past anymore. I wanted what was real, what was grounded, what was earned. I had created new routines, small but sacred. Sunday mornings were spent walking to the corner bakery for a cinnamon roll and coffee. Wednesdays were for watercolor class Fridays. I volunteered at the Literacy Center, helping women find confidence in their own voices. Women who, like me, had once been told they were too much or not enough. My home had changed too. The living room no longer held relics of obligation. I'd replaced the framed photos of forced smiles with artwork. I'd painted myself clumsy, maybe, but mine. The couch had a new cover, the walls a fresh coat of soft sage green. The guest room had been transformed into a studio, and on the desk sat a folder labeled simply Letters to Myself. Inside it were pages I'd written in recent months, not journal entries, not letters to Marissa or Eli, but letters to the woman I had become. Sometimes I wrote as if I were talking to my younger self, reminding her she did the best she could. Other times I wrote to the woman I hoped to be 10 years from now, the one who wouldn't shrink just to keep the peace. There was no bitterness left that surprised me more than anything I had expected to carry some small ember of anger, a tiny flame of hurt I could keep hidden in my chest just for myself, but it was gone, replaced with something quieter and sturdier, acceptance. Marissa hadn't tried to see me again after dropping off Eli that weekend, but she had sent a short letter through Judith. In it, she acknowledged her pride, her failure to listen, and the way she took me for granted. She didn't ask for forgiveness, not directly, but she said she was working on herself. That meant more than I thought it would. I didn't reply, not because I was shutting the door, but because I didn't want to rush anything. Rebuilding a relationship is like tending a fragile garden. You don't stomp in with good intentions. You take your time, you let it grow at its own pace, or not at all. Eli wrote me again last week. He told me about a school project on family heritage. He said he wanted to interview me if I was up for it. I wrote back, telling him he could come over Saturday and we'd bake cookies while we talked. That was enough. As I stood in the garden, I thought about legacy, not the legal kind, not what's written into wills or carved into gravestones, but the kind that lives in the way someone's face softens when they think of you. The kind that's baked into family recipes, tucked inside stories passed down at dinner tables, the kind that's felt in the quiet power of choosing yourself. Even when it's hard, I placed the rose into a small vase on my kitchen windowsill. It didn't match anything. The vase was old, slightly chipped, handed down from my mother, but it held the flower just fine. Sometimes that's all we need. A little space, something solid, and the decision to bloom again. Anyway, I turned off the porch, light locked the front door, and poured myself a cup of tea. I sat by the window with the rose watching the last of the evening sun stretch long across the yard. The light touched everything gently without needing permission, and in that still golden moment, I knew I hadn't just removed a name from a document. I had reclaimed my life quietly, completely, finally. If this story made you feel something, comment 1. If not, comment 0.